In this video, I'm going to explore the similarities between these two cars, because the Citroen over here very much inspired the Rover over here. So let's take a closer look at just what these two share. So what we have here are fairly late examples of both cars. Both date from 1974. The Citroen DS was launched in 1955 to much fanfare. The Rover P6 came along in 1963, but when you start taking a closer look, you start seeing just how similar these cars are. Both have got the wipers sort of tucked behind the bonnet, almost sitting beneath it. And if we start looking at this sort of area as well, you can see great similarities between the two cars. That's because really, like I say, the Rover was very much inspired by the DS. So launched in 1955, the DS was remarkable for its hydraulic suspension and well, it's hydraulic everything, steering and brakes all on the same system. The world just hadn't seen anything like it. And under the skin there is a skeleton that can be driven. All these panels you can see bolt on to a steel skeleton inside. The roof is plastic and sort of screwed and bonded into place. You can take the roof off, you can take all the panels off and drive around in just a bare base unit. And that methodology was very much carried over to the Rover P6. It has exactly the same sort of base unit construction. All these panels you can see bolt on, apart from these pillars which are fixed in place. If we move around the rear, the DS of course has these beautiful indicator trumpets and a slightly different rear treatment, but you'll notice how similar that is to the DS, to the P6. And then the rear styling is just pure bonkers Citroen. It's rather unlike anything I've ever seen. The Rover is a bit more conventional in that regard, but neither car is conventional in the slightest, and that's ignoring the very 70s colours of them. Lagoon blue here, Mexico brown for the P6. So while the Citroen has double wishbone front suspension and trailing arm rear linked via the hydraulic system to give different height control and self-leveling, the Rover uses an entirely different system, very, very unique, like nothing else. The front suspension acts on an arm to a horizontal even, spring that sticks out of the bulkhead. It's a bit difficult to try and imagine. Now the reason for this unusual front suspension is that the P6 was originally intended to use a turbine engine. Rover had a lot of experience with jet turbine engines. Ultimately we realised that such things weren't so good as a production car, but it's also another interesting link between two cars, because while the DS over here used 4-cylinder engines, initially from the traction avant 1930s technology in this remarkable futuristic car. Later versions had reworked engines. Originally the designers wanted an air-cooled flat 6 engine built on the success of the 2CV, and there was meant to be a flat 4 engine car in the middle, which would eventually become the GS. But even Michelin said no, at this point you're going a bit too far, so the engines remained quite conventional. And the Rover P6 came into production with a 4-cylinder engine, overhead cam, a complete new design, all alloy I think, but certainly a good proportion of it was alloy head. Not the best engine, to be honest, and that's something both cars shared. But the one trick the P6 pulled was to use the ex-Buick 3.5 litre V8 engine, which this one has. So this one has all of the waffle, and the Series 2 styling gives us these bonnet bulges and the sort of egg cratery type grille. So the P6 got the power that the DS ultimately didn't, even though later ones had fuel injection and other such bonkersness. But let's take a closer look at each vehicle. So both vehicles are Series 2 of their type really. So this is a shark nose DS, and it's got the headlamps. The inner headlamps swivel with the steering, so when you turn the wheel, those inner lamps pivot around, they are your main beam. But yeah, very aerodynamic shape. And if we have a look under the bonnet, the engine bay is largely dominated by spare wheel. The radiator sits behind, it's got its own little blind there to try and take air from the intake, which is underneath the front bumper, and scoop it up to the radiator. The engine sits a long way back, right under the bulkhead, which means that you need this little stopper here. You can remove that bung to get at the fourth spark plug, which otherwise you're not going to reach. Interestingly done, but somehow so very French. But the reason the engine sits so far back is because the gearbox is at the front. So the gearbox lives under here somewhere, tucked away under everything, underneath the steering rack, which is power steered, of course. So you've got hydraulic pipes absolutely all over the place, and there is the hydraulic pump that powers everything, and a suspension sphere over here to provide springing and damping. Wiper motor also tucked over here. But this is the second generation of engines fitted to these cars, still overhead valve, but a far better design than the old pre-war engines that the DS originally appeared with. And you can see springs and linkages all over the place. It's yeah, interesting cars to work on. There's even got a bottle of LHM sitting there in case it should be needed. LHM is the lifeblood of these cars, liquid wheel mineral, bright green fluid, even 2CVs use it, and it is far superior than ordinary brake fluid, far less damaging to paint. It is good stuff. So here's the engine bay of the Rover P6, and like I say, that suspension design, very slim, conveniently left lots of room to cram a V8 engine into the engine bay, so that worked out quite well in the end. Jet turbines might not have been the answer, but when Rover managed to buy this engine off Buick, yeah, they were sort of quids in, because loads and loads of space, great width, so it fits in quite nicely. Got huge air cleaner assembly, also used on Range Rovers, and hilariously Morgans. On Morgans they had to dent the top of this canister to fit under the bonnet, which I always found quite amusing. We've got a washer bottle down here, lovely diagram here showing, you know, your coolant capacity, 18.5 US pints, which is 8.5 litres. And yeah, as you may notice at this point, it's a 3500S. It is the manual, and that's interesting for several reasons, one of which is that it was assembled in Solihull, whereas the automatics were apparently assembled in New Zealand for the Australian market. So that's quite an interesting little tidbit. But yeah, lovely engine. The state of tune is somewhat up for debate. When they first came out, they claimed 160 brake horsepower, but I think that was an SAE figure. I think about 144 is closer to the mark. They did have to slightly detune it, because when they first launched the engine, it was designed for 5-star 100 octane fuel, and yeah, that's not something you can necessarily get anymore. But yes, an interesting look at both cars under the bonnet. We shall move on to interior appointments, and first of all I can demonstrate that the DS has frameless doors, just to add to the futuristic vibe, so that's quite joyous. And look how thick this sill is, a very strong structural member. And before I jump in, we've also got the joy of the pedals. So here's the throttle pedal. This mushroom is the brake pedal, and your pressure upon it just determines how swiftly you stop. And being a manual, this one has a clutch pedal also. The DS was available as a semi-automatic, which had a lever sprouting from the top of the steering column and the centrifugal clutch. But like I say, this one has the manual. They did really late on do an automatic as well, full-blown auto. The other thing that strikes you is it's quite cramped here, because the engine is sitting right back here. So it's kind of like a Renault 5. There's a lot of intrusion going on, not really anywhere to put your left foot, despite the fact that over here the floor is entirely flat, so it's quite easy to get across to the passenger side should you feel the need. We've also got the handbrake down here, which sort of pivots away like that, some speakers, and then we get into the exciting world of the controls. And now I must try and remember what they all do. Beautiful dashboard. We've got the wiper control on a stalk there, indicators here, and I believe a horn as well, a very little horn that sounds exactly like a 2CV horn. A little light control over here, which I'm guessing is that one there, and a flasher, yes, pushing for flash, that's quite smart. Single spoke steering wheel, of course, but I will just give you the joy of the indicators. So just put the ignition on and look at that lovely looking display, and you get both indicator lights regardless of which indicator is flashing at that point. Also got temperature gauge and fuel gauge, which almost seem like add-ons that they initially forgot about. We shall save. Oh, well, I'll try and talk around some of these lights, shall I? Bravery, that one looks like a charged light. That's hydraulic fluid level low, that's oil pressure low. And then we've got the various lights, ones that aren't really lighting up because it's not really dark enough, and hazard lights as well. Oh, there we go. And I wonder if that's oil level. No, it's a thermometer, isn't it? So maybe that's an overheat light there. But there we go, we've talked around those. Over here, I'll not try and turn the ignition off. There we go. Choke, hazard lights. That one makes the sun come out. I have a feeling that might be oh no, it's not that. That's something else. I don't know what that one is. Fan. It looks like we've got two separate fans and a heated rear window, I would assume. Also got a veteran rally award there for this one. So that's quite nice. Little glove box here, but you can put all sorts of stuff in, which someone has. A interior mirror in completely the wrong place. I say that, it's currently masking the fact there is a Suzuki Swift over there, but it does block your vision from time to time. But they couldn't put it any higher because of how low the rear window is. You just wouldn't get any view at all. But look at these immense comfortable seats, and you genuinely can call these head rests. They're designed for one's head to relax while driving. But if that does your head in, you can just undo the poppers and take them off. So that's quite good. You can even adjust the height of them there. But yeah, even that's quite a pretty design, I think. So yeah, it's an interesting cabin, but one that does have some issues. That is the original radio position, believe it or not, even though that isn't an original radio. Talk you through the gear change. Clutch down, so towards and up is first, down for second, let it spring back for third, there we go, and down to fourth. Reverse is a push and down. So it's actually quite a nice gear change, quite easy to get used to. Works better than some cars I've driven. Lovely interior door handles, lovely winding window action, if a bit mechanical. And there's a little switch for the interior light, which this car doesn't seem to have. Oh no, there they are. So that all works a treat. So let's compare with the P6. That's a much more British door shut name, but again we've got a fairly chunky sill that you must clamber over to get into the vehicle. It's much more conventional down here though, the usual sort of free pedals you might expect. And if I jump aboard, there's a bit more space as well. It's still a bit tight because we've got this rather large transmission tunnel, which actually gets larger on the automatics because the gearboxes were so huge. But if we come up, it all looks much more British, much more proper in here, I think you'll agree. And yeah, lovely little slender column stalks. So that one's your main beam switch and a flasher. And we've got the indicator stalk just down here. And if I put the ignition on, oh, I haven't put the ignition on yet apparently, or have I? That should be ignition. There we go. It's a very quiet indicator. We've got the heater fan on. We just turn that off. There we go. We've got more like an original radio in here. This has got the latest series 2 look about it. But yeah, that's the wiper switch. So it's push for wash. Got hazards over here. Interestingly, use a different relay by the sound of it. Lights. So we've got fog lights as well, have we? I don't think we've got fog lights on this one. Side, head and fog, if fitted. And then we've got interior lights on a switch as well. But that's going to stay on because I've got the door open. Cigarette lighter, I would assume, yes. Heat, and where you want said heat. Petrol reserve, if you run out of fuel on your main tank, you go onto the reserve tank. Just turn the ignition off. Choke control is down here, and a single speaker hides behind here. Being the V8, it's got the manual gear change, and it feels quite different actually to the still a very notchy change, but quite different to the 4-cylinder one I had a 4-cylinder manual. I'm sure that was a smaller lever. We've got glove boxes on both sides, so one down there containing a load of documents and getting in the way of the keys, and one over here. Oh, and this I forgot about that little map reading light. Oh yeah, that's what that first position is. It's a little map reading light there. Oh, that's quite sweet. Winding windows again. Plenty of vinyl in this one, so the box pleat vinyl, which is very typical of a Series 2. You also had the option of head restraints, which this one has front and rear. But I'm getting ahead of ourselves. Let's jump into the rear of the D. Sitting in the back of the D, there's reasonable headroom, but that roof does swoop down a bit to rob me of too much more, which is why presidential ones tended to have extra higher roofs. They were very much coach built. But look at the knee room. So much space back here. And the softest, bounciest seat. It's marvellous. I've even got a centre armrest. This isn't original upholstery, but it's a very good choice by the owner. I think it's absolutely brilliant. And he's had a little extra cut off just to try and protect the material here across the back of the seat. But quite warm with this goldfish bowl of a rear window going on, but oh so spacious. And I've done a fair few miles in the back of these, and they are fabulous ways to travel. But how does the Rover compare? Well, initial impressions are quite good. I've got this head restraint, but as my head goes back onto it, my head hits the roof, so it's a bit tight back here as well. I've got a centre armrest, and even seatbelts have been added to this one. They wouldn't have been standard at the time. But the biggest problem is legroom. Look at the difference, and that's because the P6 is rear wheel drive, and it also has a fairly complex De Dion rear suspension. So it's yeah, it's sort of, I got told off for calling it fully independent. It sort of isn't, because the two wheels are linked by a De Dion tube, but it's quite complex and takes up a lot of space, and that means compared to the DS, I'm struggling a bit here. That is tight, and the back of this seat is very hard. It's not the most comfortable place to sit. It feels a little claustrophobic. On the plus side, I've got opening rear quarter lights, which are quite jolly. And the window will go a good way down. I would suggest all the way down. So that's good. And yeah, you get a nice view of the road ahead. In terms of boot space, the DS pulls off a bit of a party trick, because ignoring the fact we've got quite a lot of chairs and stuff in here, it always looks to me like the boot floor of a DS is lower than the ground you're standing on. So there's actually a fair bit of space in there, albeit it's all quite low. I have seen one DS with a hatchback conversion, and that just transforms it. It just makes this area so much more usable. You can see a bolt there. I'm wondering what it's for. Oh, it's just a bolt, is it? Okay. A bit of fruit ventilation going on down there as well. Yeah, I've no idea why there's a bolt there. That's quite interesting. But I will just point out, you can take the rear wings off with the starting handle. There's just one bolt, and then that comes off, because obviously if you're going to change a wheel, you kind of need ready access to the wheels. That's a party trick we might explore in a separate video. Yes, D Special, this is actually the bottom of the range. This is your ID replacement. So the DS was launched, and then the ID came later. It was more simple, had fewer power assists. This has all the power assists, but yeah, it's now become a D Special, which is a bit unfair because we're comparing it with this top of the range Rover P6 over here. We shall pop the boot lid here, he says, and the boot is still okay, but not quite as capacious. We've got the battery is stored over here, and there are car covers here. The boot floor does not appear to be lower than the ground, but you still got that same square shape. A very big fuel tank in the V8, something like 68 litres I think, which does reduce the space somewhat, which is why quite a lot of P6s have a boot mounted spare wheel instead. But then that of course makes this panel very heavy to lift, and it's already creaking, poor thing. Incidentally, I do like the English number plates on this car. I think they really do look the part. So there you go. Hopefully that was a very interesting look at these two similar cars, similar yet very, very different, one being the inspiration for the other. This one's already getting quite long, I can tell, just as I'm recording it. So we'll do a separate video looking at the very different driving dynamics of these two cars. They've both got that base unit construction and independent suspension all round, sort of in the case of the Rover. But yeah, how does that translate out on the road? I'm afraid you're going to have to join me in a future video to find out, and I look forward to seeing you in it. Farewell.